So to the attendees, I will say, please be sure to type your questions for Rhett into the chat window. And while you do that, I will begin our panel Q&A discussion with a few questions for Russ. So Russ, you mentioned, I'm going to start with a management question. I mean, you mentioned that these higher rates of earlier snowmelts are affecting irrigation water availability in ways that are, fairly local and depend on local conditions. But I'm wondering if, I'm sure we're all interested in thinking about this question a lot in the West, are there any sort of general observations you can make about how these higher rates of earlier snowmelt affect irrigation water availability?
Sure. There are a couple of answers to that. Certainly, if you think of just the earlier runoff in a natural flow context, that would certainly mean that runoff would happen earlier and likely would happen before irrigators had the possibility of pulling it off because they just simply didn't have the need for it on the fields. But we actually live in a very highly managed system, both in terms of physical infrastructure as well as the management and legal system. And those kind of interact with those natural flows. For example, in terms of the physical infrastructure, there's reservoir storage both on surface reservoirs as well as groundwater, as well as infrastructure with canals and things like that enable us to move water around from one place to another and store it. So that helps partially offset some of the effect of that earlier runoff. And then secondly, water rights and an individual irrigator or water district irrigation's seniority is also going to affect the outcome in terms of the effect on irrigation water availability, in that earlier runoff may affect juniors more significantly, but that's also somewhat dependent on the specific scenario. To give one example, Jackson Reservoir in Wyoming, on the Upper Snake, represents storage that's owned primarily by junior water rights holders. And so when we have earlier runoff and such that the senior water rights holders can't actually make use of the water, that allows the junior water rights holders to store it for their own use later in the irrigation season. So if the seniors aren't able to use it at the time of runoff and the juniors are able to store it, then later in the summer when they want it, that water actually then belongs to the juniors because the seniors couldn't make use of it when it would have run off. And so that actually gives in that odd scenario, gives an advantage to some juniors. So the answer really is that certainly the earlier natural runoff would affect water availability, but you have to also view that in the context of the highly managed system that also interacts with that earlier runoff.
Great, thank you. And I want to ask you just one more question, or perhaps two, before we move on to a few questions for Rhett. So you, Russ, you provided some near-term predictions for this summer, and I'm wondering how confident we can be in these predictions. And I guess we could start by asking you if you have any insight on the past accuracy of outlook predictions.
Sure. So I don't actually work with the predictions themselves, but the Climate Prediction Center that puts out those outlooks does go back and look at how successful their outlooks, that were made, say, for example, prior to the beginning of the winter were, and do an assessment of how successful they were. And a number of things factor into how they model or formulate these outlooks, and a lot of them have to do with things like teleconnections, like the El Nino, La Nina, what we term the ENSO or El Nino Southern Oscillation. So that really relates to the sea surface temperature in the equatorial Pacific. And there are teleconnections with that, between that and weather that we experience in North America, and particularly in the West. So what they really rely on are connections between or correlations between conditions of a certain degree of El Nino or La Nina that often affect the western U.S. in a certain way. And so if you just look back at the previous winter, we had a fairly strong La Nina in place, and that should have predicted particular conditions in the western U.S. and kind of significantly atypically, the particular prediction for this last winter was quite a bit off based on it having been based on a strong La Nina that should have predicted kind of colder conditions in the Northwest, and we actually experienced relatively warmer conditions in the Northwest. So they kind of rely on statistical correlations between various things, and sometimes something can happen that throws a wrench in that. And I looked at some of the comparisons, and it looks like this particular year, in terms of the winter, looking back at their forecast for the winter, was substantially off, but it was quite unusually off in comparison to, say, the set of the 20 previous years of predictions. It was quite significantly off. So it can be off, and they are related to correlations rather than really modeling temperatures. And what part of the discussion that the CPC offers on that is when they run a simulation, the outcome of the simulation largely can depend on slight modifications to the initial conditions. So you run a model, you set it up with and specify what are things like at the very beginning of a season when we run our model. And then they'll typically tweak that slightly for about 30 different simulations. And the results from those outputs can be quite significantly different and span quite a range. And so they'll try to take something that has a fairly high frequency of recurrence, but they can't. Even those models will sometimes show quite divergent conditions when they end up having to pick one that is fairly frequently occurring among what they call the ensemble of those 30 different perturbations of things. But sometimes those will predict like this really odd year, but it's not very commonly produced by the models, so they don't post that as their outlook or their projection. But sometimes those end up being the ones that occur.
Great. And this leads me to wonder about longer-term predictions, especially given the model discussion that you've just shared with us. And I'm wondering, given your long career working with weather data, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on where we're headed with climate change, particularly in the West.
Well, certainly it looks like things have warmed in the West. And from the literature that I've read and things that I've worked with, it appears as though there's already an influence of that on snowpack, particularly in the coastal ranges that are lower elevation. The snowpack accumulation to some degree is a little bit of a binary process where if the temperatures are below freezing, you're going to accumulate snow, and if they're above freezing, the precipitation will occur as rain. And so it's not exactly just a gradation, like 1 degree is going to make it a little bit warmer. It kind of makes a switch where things go on and off based on either snow or precipitation, depending on the temperature. And so as you're closer to that dividing line with elevation, the change to a winter that gives more rainfall than snow, it tends to occur. So we've tended to see that in the lower elevation mountains represented by the Cascades, whereas it's been less prevalent in the higher mountains in the interior, in the Rockies. So with the precipitation, when precipitation has been higher, generally the snow water equivalent just simply raised to match that, because they were still largely at temperatures that were low enough that precipitation would fall as snow in the interior mountains, whereas a fraction of that was converted to rainfall in the Cascades. Now, if temperatures continue to increase fairly significantly, we could begin to see even some of the interior mountains beginning to experience that same kind of a shift to lower snow storage and more precipitation during the winter accumulation period.
Thank you, Russ. Much appreciated. And so now I have a few questions for Rhett. Rhett, I'm wondering, you mentioned that the polar vortex was squeezing fertilizer supply as some producers backed down on production to sell natural gas back to the grid. And I'm wondering, even absent that kind of event, do fluctuations in energy prices impact the cost of fertilizer production, and to what extent are those fluctuations in natural gas prices passed on to farmers?
It does. I would say it's more of a long-term. A short-term spike typically is not something I believe would be passed on to a farmer. I think what made it just unique this year was the timing of it, where, the ability for a producer of any fertilizer to remain at really high prices, they have to figure out how to keep the market tight. And it's such a competitive market that usually when the U.S. spikes in prices, you see a lot of imports come in, and that's no matter what the NPK is. And it didn't happen this year because they couldn't get here in time for the spring season. And even with the armada of urea that has been pointed to the U.S., now we have to physically get it off of the Gulf and work its way up the river system and into the Midwest right at the same time that producers are hitting the field. It just makes for unique. So, yes, it does matter, but it matters if natural gas stays at, say, $3.75 an MMBTU for 3 to 6 months versus, a 2-3 week blip.
Well, that makes sense. And you've mentioned a number of times now that the timing of fertilizer production and inventory. So what is the timing of fertilizer production? So fertilizer that farmers are applying to fields now was produced when, or how storable is it?
The production is a year-round piece. The timing is different by region in terms of producers are always producing it. They have enough storage, but at some point, they're going to have to entice growers and really the commercial outfits, the co-ops, the retailers like a Simplot, to go in and buy that and store it on their behalf because they can't store all of their fertilizer. And most growers don't have significant fertilizer storage either. We're seeing some of that increase on the liquid side, but historically they put that into grain storage. So to your point, it happens all of the time, and there's seasonalities to each region where they typically entice somebody else to take that off their hands at a lower price. And right now it's just unique because those transactions had already happened when we got the polar vortex, right? So now supplies just overnight really tighten up on us, and it's at our peak demand season.
Great. Thank you. I also wanted to ask you one last question. You spoke about imports and exports, and there's clearly an active global fertilizer market that is influenced by freight and duties. And I was wondering about Simplot in particular. Does Simplot export fertilizers?
We do. So if you think about it, we've got our phosphate production in the West. Some of that works its way up to Western Canada. Some of it in various products work its way down to Mexico as well. We're not big-time exporters. If you look at the U.S. market in general, it needs to import a lot of product, and we buy some imported product as well. So there's not a whole lot leaving the U.S.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Rhett, and also you, Russ, for your presentations today. I've certainly learned a lot, and I think we all have. So we are finishing up now, but I do have a few things I'd like to share with our attendees. So today's webinar is just one in a series covering the challenging times we face in agriculture. One other upcoming webinar will cover climate risk and tools for management in May, so please stay tuned for the date and other details on that upcoming webinar. We would also like to hear from you about topics or presentations that you would like to see offered in the future. So please either send us an entry into the chat window on your screen or send us an email to information@farmmanagement.org to share your ideas on topics for future webinars. We have created a feedback survey for you. Please do click on the link in the chat window to access the questions and provide feedback to our Ag in Uncertain Times team. Thank you for that. And finally, as mentioned earlier, the recordings and other information for this webinar will be available at the Ag in Uncertain Times website. If you are interested in a copy of any of today's presentation slides, they are also available for download. To find them, please point your browser to aginuncertaintimes.farmmanagement.org and select the Webinars tab. And let me close again by extending our thanks to today's speakers, Russ Qualls and Rhett Adams, for their first-class presentations on 2021 Snow and Water Outlook and Simplot and NPK Overview. Thanks also to our Ag and Uncertain Times team and their sponsoring institutions for making this series possible. We would also like to thank all the participants in today's webinar conference. We sincerely hope that you find today's content of value in your work, and we hope to see you again in one of our upcoming programs. Until then, we offer you our sincerest hope for success in meeting the challenges of today's uncertain times. For Ag and Uncertain Times, I'm Kristiana Hansen. Thank you.